Chapter 11. The Lomkoth Habamarer Campaign to Conquer Habamari. Whether Hania surrendered or not, they had to take Habamari. The Thunderpeel fleet stopped right in front of the Habamari portal. This was because they had to wait for the arrival of supplies, particularly mobile spacetime mines. Even this late in the game, the enemy had shut itself inside the Habamari portal and refused to come out, apart from the small ships that emerged every once in a while, their purpose being, of course, reconnaissance. The Star Forces could hardly let them do as they pleased. On the planar space side, ships were placed very near the portal spiral to chase after any enemies that appeared. Of course, even the Star Forces did not neglect to take a peek. Voyeurism had been a chronic disorder in the military since ancient times. In 3 space, Thunderpeel Fleet 1 simply sent in its strongest raid ships. The enemy was also on guard. The military was voyeuristic, but it had no exhibitionist streak. In fact, it was extremely loath to be seen. Just as the Star Forces were lying in wait on the planar space side, the forces of the 4 Nations Alliance were fully prepared to intercept over in the 3 space side. The recon mission raid ships simultaneously passed through the portal and shot out unmanned exploration probes in all directions, greedily soaking in information. Yet at the same time, enemy rounds were zooming closer. Of the raid ships that were tasked with the recon enforce mission, 3 were pierced by lasers immediately after passing through the portal, one of them never to return. However, thanks to their efforts, the enemy's situation had become quite clear. In 3 space, portals were phosphorescent spheres. In the Habamari system, the portal revolved around its main planet, Sijarok. And enemy ships had gathered in orbit around Sijarok as well. 80% were estimated to be Hanian ships. The rest belonged to the PSSU, but most of them were ships that had successfully withdrawn during the previous battle. The percentage of ships that were damaged must have been considerable. Though they'd been able to gain an understanding of the enemy's movements and positions in the Sijarok area, there was a possibility that reserve forces were hidden behind a distant celestial body. Even bearing that in mind, however, the enemy's strength was deemed to be less than half that of the Allied corps. If they faced off in planar space, the power gap was such that there was 0 chance of defeat, but it was a little more precarious considering that they were the side pushing into the portal. Meeting after meeting was held at the overall flagship Klibnikek until supplies arrived. However, the outline of the operation had already been decided. Now all their work lay in assessing the information and, if that information called for it, making minor modifications to the predetermined strategy. The enemy's political situation has become quite evident, reported Senior Information Staff Officer Nato at a meeting. To put it briefly, the PSSU is in a state of partial occupation by the Hania Federation. Occupation, you say? Lafier was understandably surprised. Viewed objectively, it looks like what we'd call an occupation, but I think they probably view it differently, he explained with a wry smile. It was said that the PSSU and the Federation, sensing an impending invasion, decided to destroy the Thunderpeel fleet jointly. It seemed as though their command centers had been hurriedly amalgamated in the process. As Hania had invested the greater number of ships, they had more say in things. Though the main battlefield was situated in the PSSU's sphere of influence, the Supreme Commander was apparently a Hanian Commodore. As one might expect, there seemed to be some discontent amidst the PSSU. Furthermore, since the new system was created in haste, it was no well-oiled machine. The command centers at each level of command were all composed jointly by both militaries, but it appeared that internal conflicts flared up from time to time. And that resulted in the misfires surrounding the defense of Habamari. It was also said that the Habamari Defense Forces Supreme Commander was a Federation soldier. Since Habamari was an important military base to the PSSU, it had had a defense headquarters for a long time. With the strengthening of the defense forces, the size of that command center expanded in kind. The newly appointed commandant there seemed also to be a Federation soldier. The operation up until that point had been intercepting attacks near the Habamari portal, but the new Supreme Commander ordered a more aggressive, proactive counterattack. However, at that point, the reinforcements, whose core was made up of Federation forces, were on the move, and the Supreme Commander himself had not proceeded to his new appointment. With no other options, the PSSU troops that had already taken up their positions sortied without help and were defeated. Then, is the Federation trying to chip away at the military power of the Union, its own ally? Lafier couldn't explain it any other way. Their intentions remain a mystery. If that is indeed the case, there's no way they would admit it. Perhaps they're merely that horrifically incompetent. If, however, the Federation's plan was to have this battle whittle away at our forces before we engage with them, then it makes more sense. But then how did they explain it to their allies? As an operation to buy time, I imagine. It had been an operation to keep the Star forces at bay until their defense was set up and ready. And it had yielded results. The Thunderpeel fleet was currently at a stalemate before the Habamary portal. Even so, thought Lafier, wouldn't the simplest and most effective strategy have been to put all hands to the pump in a decisive battle in the portal's vicinity? Lafier could only conclude that the Hanian military really did want to pare down the PSSU military. I see. So that's what's behind the occupation. Lafier was reminded of the Watchguard fleet during the fall of Lokvakar. It wasn't a pleasant feeling. That fleet had been led by Lafier's grandmother Lamos, the 27th Empress. The predicament was similar in that they were forced into a losing battle to buy time. But the Watchguard fleet had stepped willingly onto a battlefield bereft of hope in order to leave the Empire with that little bit more of a future, whereas these PSSU troops had been thrown forth so as to preserve the strength of the arrogant and overbearing alliance. She kicked herself for even drawing a comparison. It was then her adjutant stood up. During the meeting, he processed a huge number of reports meant for the commander-in-chief's ears. He usually saved them for later, but he informed her of whatever he decided she urgently needed to hear. Glaherer, Jint whispered to Lafier. An interbubble communication has come in from Vice Chief of Staff Ekriua, who is now aboard the battle line ship Ursam. It appears they're headed here with the mines taken from Fleet 5 in tow. Let me speak to whoever's in charge, said Lafier. Yes, ma'am. Lafier's wrist gear put her through to the Drokia Glagam, Command Center Communications Officer. Unfortunately, the information transmission rate with interbubble communications was glacial. The conversation could only be dreadfully slow-moving, but she gleaned what she wanted to know for the time being. Obviously, minds alone could not travel long distances. As such, Ekriua reloaded and returned with a battle line ship that had withdrawn to Fonbo due to running out of mines. She was the highest-ranked star pilot among the corps of battle line ships coming in from Fonbo. Some Glagam Iadbirabotutter, strike subfleet command centers, fell back, either to Fonbo or to a base further back than it. It seems a conveyance ship has already departed from the Ursam. Details upon arrival. I see. Good work. Lafier cut the call with the communication operator. I believe I shall have the Associate Commodore take command for the mine battle. Any thoughts? For this mine battle, they would be firing mines into the Habamary portal in concert with the consort ships rushing through. No advanced command skills would be required. I worry about the staff officers, said Sabash. I'd like to have Nombak and Leksh head there. That's fine, nodded Lafier. Nombak was dejected. I'm a liaison officer again? While it was true that a stately position like Kasariak Byra Rodrikar, Thunderpeel Fleet Staff Officer, was above him, considering his service record, he took pride in the fact that he'd worked assiduously by the future Empress's side from a young age. Reaching the Ursam momentarily, stated Leksh. We'll fuse in 10 seconds. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Space-time fusion underway. Nombak and Leksh were aboard the conveyance ship. Leksh's rank was lower than Nombaka's, so she was serving as the skipper. Space-time bubbles had strict mass limits and only fit one battle line ship inside, since they were so colossal. The Ursam, too, was projecting a bubble all by itself. The conveyance ship came alongside the Ursam, and the two turned up at the bridge without delay. Battle line ships came with command center facilities, such that they could serve as squadron flagships at any time. That was where Ekriua was, and she was alone. According to what they heard afterward, she'd left the assistants that she'd taken out of the command center with her at the Fonbo base core. Ekriua worked with Fleet 5 and formulated a transport system that would function without her, but she had them stay behind for liaison work. When the battle line ship and conveyance ship fused, an information link was established between them, and a vast amount of information was exchanged. Ekryua was giving that information a read-through when Nombok and Leksh entered the room, and by the looks of it, she had already grasped what she should do. She got the new post greetings over with quickly and issued her orders. Vice Hecto Commander Nombok, you help with unit formation. Deca Commander Leksh, you compile all the info. Roger that, replied Nombok for the both of them. We will get on it right away. And Nombok set about creating a unit formation plan on the double. A short time later, Leksh reported, an interbubble communication from Thunderpeel Fleet Command. Your corps is designated Bioer by Pochutina Rodrikater, Thunderpeel Fleet 3.1. Associate Commodore Ekryua, who had just been appointed the Glaherer Bioer by Pochutina, Fleet 3.1 Commander-in-Chief, nodded disinterestedly. What point on its other dimensional counterpart a given position on the planar or 3-space side of a portal corresponded to was determined probabilistically. In other words, it wasn't clear where on the portal one would emerge when one crossed universes. In planar space, portals traced distorted spirals. In 3-space, they were spherical. For example, say someone crossed the spiral at a certain point and emerged from the sphere at a certain point. Then say that person were to cross the spiral at the same point as before. They wouldn't necessarily emerge from the sphere at the same point as before. In fact, the odds were overwhelmingly high that they'd enter 3-space from a different point. This phenomenon also held true the other way around, i.e., crossing into the spiral from the sphere. This physical law gave the defending side of a battle involving portals the natural advantage. Once the offending side passed through a portal, its formations would invariably end up in disarray. The Star Forces had accumulated a wealth of experience fighting in planar space, and it had established a means of counteracting this, albeit one few would call perfect. Having both the warships and mobile space-time mines cross the portal at the same time was the oldest trick in the book. The general rule was to cross over one ship type at a time. That way, even if the ships belonged to different units or squadrons, they could coordinate with relative ease. Thunderpeel Fleet Command decided to send in first the raid ships, then the assault ships, then the patrol ships. All other types of ship would transition into 3-space once the area surrounding the portal was brought fully under control. Defense and battle line ships were indispensable in planar space, but didn't have too much of a role to play in 3-space. Battle line ships in particular became nothing more than bleary-eyed targets. It was the battle line ship corps, however, that fired the first rounds. In this battlefield, Bioer by Pochutina, Fleet 3.1, commanded by Associate Commodore Ekryua, bore that task. The vessels of the Thunderpeel Fleet assumed their places. An interbubble communication from Fleet Command reported Leksh. The mine offensive schedule we proposed has been approved. Ekryua nodded, then looked at Nombok. Issuing the order now. The proposed schedule had already been conveyed to all of the battle line ships under their jurisdiction. All that was needed now was to tell them to launch the mines as planned. A short, predetermined code was transmitted by the battle line ship Ursam via an interbubble communication, after which the Ursam itself prepared to torpedo the enemy. The mines that were snatched from Fleet 5 were ejected to sit inside the Ursama's bubble temporarily. The ship commander had the authority to fire mines. As Glagam Bioer by Pochutina, Fleet 3.1 Command, had been ordered to follow the originally planned schedule, they simply waited for their moment. It's time, said Nombok, who turned his gaze to the planar space map. Mine after mine split off from the Ursam. Small bubbles were also splitting off from other battle line ships. Then Fleet 3.1, having finished its first and last combat role, began falling back, passing by the advancing columns of the patrol ship corps. The mine swarm slipped through the assault ship corps and approached the raid ship corps. The raid ship corps went on the move. Nombok shouted, a bit wound up, now charging. If this is how it's going to be, he thought, I'd have liked to watch from the commander's bridge of the Klibnikek. The raid ship corps plunged into the Habamari portal alongside the mine swarm. Viewed from the planar space side, it was a serene sight, but it had to be a very different story when viewed from the 3-space side. The assault ship corps started rushing through. The patrol ship corps were waiting behind them. The Glagak Daka Birer, overall fleet flagship, slipped into the patrol ship corps and crossed over with them. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, passing through. The tension ran high in the commander's bridge of the patrol ship Klibnikek. The staff officers were busy compiling and analyzing information, as well as reorganizing their forces. Naturally, Lafier couldn't afford to just look on indifferently, either. She switched her Frocross from a personal radius to beyond the ship mode. The information crunched by the patrol ship's detectors and sensors traveled through her frosh into the Realbedo navigation area of her brain. The staff officers disappeared from her spatiosensory world, replaced by the planet Sijarok and its environs. She closed her eyes and focused her Frocross. She was now one with the patrol ship Klibnikek. She quickly learned it was a melee out there. She gave up trying to get a grasp of the confusing space rumble by her own power. Looking at the information analyzed by her staff would not only be more precise, it'd be faster too. The Klibnikek brushed against the planet Sijarok's atmosphere, and it felt to Lafier as if her own body brushed against it. Mobile strongholds were lined up in orbit around the planet. Said strongholds were too heavy to travel through planar spaces. Some of them had been constructed on Sijarok, which was one large base for munitions and war industries, but more than half had been brought in from the Hania Federation. In all likelihood, they disassembled the forts tasked with defending Hania-aligned planets, transported the parts through planar space, and then reassembled them. It might well be just as Dasef said, thought Lafier. The chances that Hania was devoting the lion's share of its war resources to this front were seeming higher and higher. I wonder how Father and Duir are doing, considering they're supposed to be fighting against the Federation elsewhere. But she soon banished those thoughts. It was time to give the enemy before her eyes her undivided attention. The amount of objects orbiting Sijarok made it seem dusty, like a gritty sphere of space debris, destroyed ships, the fragments of forts and civilian facilities. And the remains of those who were resting in peace were among the debris hurtling into the planet's atmosphere, tracing countless streaks of light on their way down. And it wasn't just matter that Sijarok's atmosphere had to contend with. Leaked masses of antimatter fuel caused the outer atmosphere to shine as soon as it came into contact with anything else, including air. Tide of war analysis complete, said Sabash. Entering it in now. The fourth-dimensional space-time that Lafier saw through her Frocross changed. Now, whether they were enemy ships, allies, or neither, they stood out in sharp relief, making the state of the scuffle much more apparent. She suddenly recalled her days as an assault ship captain. Back then, all she had to do was fight inside the cramped arena that was a space-time bubble. The assault came with a mood-elevating high that often made the crew muse that carnivores must feel the same way when they attacked their prey. She chided herself. Such uplifted moods were now impermissible. She needed to judge things calmly and with presence of mind. She could see where in the battlefield things were flowing and where things were stagnant. Allied ships were trying to move, but the enemy stood obstinately in the way. It seemed to her that with just a little push from a different direction, the obstacles would be removed, and the current would flow forcefully ahead. Lafier pulled out her command baton and stood up. Then she pointed with the baton at the crowd of Allied ships she perceived through her Frocross. "Have those troops advance over here," she said, moving the baton. "They're to join with the troops here and then shoot the enemy's flank." Using the baton, she indicated the forces in question, marked them, and pointed out the path they were to take. The space-time Lafier and her staff officers perceived through the respective navigation areas of their brains was synchronized. The movements of the baton that was physically being wielded on the bridge were also transmitted via Frocross to all the people that were physically present. The staff officers understood the instructions handed down by the command baton's motions clearly and precisely. Well, with one exception. Lafier recalled a conversation she'd had with Jint back when she was the training fleet commander-in-chief. "Right, I get what you're doing on an intellectual level," he'd said, oddly forlornly. "But I don't have Frocross, so to me, it just looks like you're playing with a baton." Jint was on the bridge now, too. His adjutant line of duty involved assisting with the commander-in-chief's office and clerical work, so he was more than capable of doing his job without knowing how the battle was playing out at any given moment. Yet Leifir imagined he might feel somewhat alienated regardless. She was thinking about that kind of thing in the back of her mind even as she brandished her command baton and gave directions. In accordance with her orders, the staff officers formed temporary corps and assigned battle objectives. The effects were remarkable. Gone was the melee as order was born on the battlefield. Enemy ships were getting pushed out of orbit around Sigerak. Jint never even dreamed Leifir might be worrying about him. Unlike the staff officers, an adjutant didn't have any missions to carry out during battle. As such, he might inevitably feel alienated even if he did have a Frocross. He often killed time by finishing up everyday business even as combat raged outside. This time, however, he had no time to kill. Nor was this any time to be feeling left out. "May I speak with your commander?" said the cross-looking elderly woman on the screen, who introduced herself as the mayor of Pole City. Jint didn't know the first thing about Pole City, and the CompuCrystal network's memory net had no information on it besides the fact it was a city on the planet Sigerak. The mayor was claiming that some sort of structure crashed down onto the city's suburbs, and she was lodging a protest and a demand for compensation for the damages. "I'm sure you understand how terribly busy our commander-in-chief is, Mayor," said Jint. "I believe we may discuss repayment of damages after the battle has concluded through the Habamari Star System government." Pole City wasn't the only one that wanted a word. Plenty of other local governments were also sending calls and messages to Fleet Command. Needless to say, Jint could hardly report every single one of them to Leifir. She was busy waving her baton around. Perhaps accepting the calls was a mistake to begin with, but they would have to get the government of Habamari to bend the knee later. They would probably counsel Habamari to surrender and then negotiate. Laying the groundwork for those negotiations was the job of the adjutant and his subordinates. As such, Jint wanted to prepare in advance by gathering information on the land world. "So you say," said the mayor, "but what will happen if your side loses?" "If we should have the misfortune of being defeated, we would have no other option but to retreat," he replied politely, as astonished as he was that she would take this line. "Of course. And if that happens, how will we get compensated? Perhaps you could file that request with the People's Sovereign Stellar Union?" Their intel stated that the Peace SU was effectively already occupied by the Hania Federation. Yet, despite knowing that didn't stop Jint from making that suggestion. He was trying to get her to confirm that that was indeed the case. She didn't take the bait. "According to our investigation, the fallen structure that inflicted such severe damage to my city is a vessel belonging to your military. All the more reason to seek compensation from the Union then, ma'am. Our forces are an injured party in this," he said, as he inwardly prayed for the souls of the soldiers and personnel whose ship got shot down. "If your military never started a battle here, there wouldn't be any injured parties at all." Mayor," said Jint, unable to give her any more of his time. "We wish to build a rapport with the fine folks of your planet. That's why we are paying heed to your concerns even in the midst of combat. However, as I stated earlier, we would like to negotiate regarding reparations through the Star System government. We don't currently have any plans to discuss these matters with local governments." Jint meant to cut the call then and there, but the second he was about to, a declaration he couldn't ignore came flying out of the mayor's mouth. "The Star System government no longer exists." "Pardon me? Are you saying that the Star System government has been dissolved?" Their intel said nothing of the sort. To be sure, there had been no call request from the Star System, which had always been essential up until now. This had baffled Jint, and he'd had half a mind to ask for a compiling of demands, but as an adjutant, he lacked the power to contact them unilaterally from his side. And he figured it was nothing to bother the fleet commander-in-chief over when they were in the middle of combat. Sigerak's news reportage was of course being tapped. The information staff officer was in charge of that, and it wasn't as though an adjutant like Jint would be informed if something as important as the Star System government disappearing came to light through their efforts. On the other hand, the Star Forces traditionally paid little interest to land world circumstances, so they didn't bother reading between the lines. The news was merely recorded. If, hypothetically, a media blackout were implemented, the star forces might not even notice, especially since they were locked in combat. The information officer had a lot of other tasks to prioritize. It still exists on the books, of course. But it's a shambling zombie, a corpse puppeteered by a parasite. Would that parasite be the Hania Federation? If the PSSU was truly subordinate to Hania now, then their being controlled at the star system government level came as no surprise. Moreover, this was no ordinary planet, it was a military base. Who can say, said the mayor evasively. You believe that your military has been taken over, even as it's currently fighting against our military? Asked Jint. And that's why you won't file your complaint with the PSSU? All I'll say is, it's a fact that the fleet is no longer under Central's control. Otherwise, they would never take our young ones out to die someplace far from home without resisting, don't you agree? Central must be referring to the PSSU's central government. And she was blasting the military for launching a sortie from Habamari. Whatever their relationship with the Federation actually was, she clearly wasn't fond of the PSSU's current state of affairs. Jint reckoned she might even regard the Empire as liberating them from the Federation's clutches. Be that as it may, I am unable to answer with any kind of authority, nor can I have the Commander-in-Chief discuss this with you. Now then, if you'll excuse me. Jint really did cut the call this time. He gazed at the screen in front of him. A slew of call requests were displayed there, but none of them were from the star system government. They were all from local governments. There were other call requests from private organizations and citizens, which obviously couldn't be replied to, given the sheer volume of calls, but those were filtered out. Jint nearly winced at the giant list, but he decided to start with the one at the top, the call from the province of Inanna. The elderly man on the other side introduced himself as the governor of Inanna province. I know you must be quite busy, but I would like to make a brief comment. What is it, sir? Asked Jint guardedly. Thanks to you all, the sky is so very beautiful. I mean it when I say the night sky tonight is dreadfully beautiful. Truly, this night has stirred my soul. Is that so? This offended Jint. I would be pleased if you could bear in mind that that beauty has brought with it the deaths of officers in both our militaries, for starters. You go out of your way to wage war all the way up in space. Surely death is not such an abominable thing to you people? You think it an honor, do you not? Though we find that difficult to understand. Pure prejudice, thought Jint. He didn't, however, see the point in correcting the governor's distorted views. We acknowledge your thoughts regarding the sky. Will that be all, sir? No, I'll be getting to the real issue at hand now. I have had my fill of this dazzling night sky. That's enough now. I would like you to close this show down post-haste. So you're requesting a suspension of hostilities? Indeed. If so, I advise you to take it up with your military. The battle is progressing in our favor. Your military has but to surrender, and then there will be no reason to continue fighting. In truth, as Jint wasn't a staff officer and didn't possess Frokraz, he didn't actually have a grasp of the war situation. He simply concluded they were winning from the conversations and overall atmosphere on the bridge. Our military doesn't exist. Or at least, not in this system. It seemed the governor of Inanna held the same point of view as the mayor of Paul. Are you saying that you perceive the current battle as a battle between our Imperial Star forces and the Hanian military? No. It's the Four Nations Alliance military. From what we understand, sir, your nation is a member of that alliance. Well, at the very least, we can be sure that your military isn't fighting a PSSU fleet. The governor was being evasive, but this hardly shocked Jint anymore. Allow me to just confirm something. Are you in contact with the Star System government, sir? We can contact them when necessary, of course. Jint felt relieved. The Star System government still exists, then, right? They carry out day-to-day affairs for us. That sounds like a very diplomatic way to put that, sir, said Jint frankly. I suppose it does, shrugged the governor. Your military is already abreast, I imagine? What might you be referring to, sir? That the Star System government originally intended to declare the system open and undefended. What? Jint blinked. It may just be because I'm not familiar with your nation's legal system, but that sounds strange to me. Is such a thing possible? It was just the system flexing its sovereignty. In the PSSU, Star System governments have state sovereignty. I see. So the Star System's government got purged because it rebelled, huh? While Jint was personally very curious as to whether that was true, that went beyond Jint's job description. In addition, he was exasperated that this might cause an unforeseen roadblock in negotiations with the Star System government. "We're getting a signal of surrender," reported the communications staff officer. "All enemy ships are transmitting the signal of surrender simultaneously." The Star System government aside, the enemy fleet had capitulated. Jint heard the pride in Leifir's voice. "All ships, cease fighting. Order the enemy ships to stop accelerating. I hereby allow attacks on enemy ships that continue accelerating without legitimate cause." Jint grinned and told the man still on his screen, "Governor, I have some good news for you." Sadly, it wasn't all good news on the bridge. The antimatter fuel factories have begun self-destructing. What seem to be ship construction and repair facilities have as well. "Tell the enemy fleet to stop the destruction sequence," ordered Leifir, albeit with a somewhat resigned tone. It was most likely a waste of effort. They didn't know who had given the self-destruction order, but that person probably did so knowing they would be held accountable for it. There was no way that person was going to cancel those orders now, and everyone at the bridge knew it. Jint felt depressed. While the Empire and the Star Forces were more penny-pinched than in years gone by, they hadn't fallen so low as to target and depend on the enemy's assets. That being said, having access to them certainly would have helped. Even in the Star Force's heyday, they would have liked to get their hands on those resources intact, because then they could expect a reduction in time spent voyaging. Even if the voyage ended, though, Jint had no home to return to. Since the war started, the Count of Hyde's manor kept moving from one combat vessel's residential quarters to another. So long as Leifir's staff officers weren't discharged, he would probably have to continue living on the Klibnikek, but whether they were in the battlefield or at the rear had an effect on his mood. And above all, he had a frugal disposition one wouldn't expect from a noble like him, so the fact that useful facilities had been destroyed was hard to accept. "So, what's this, good news?" asked the governor innocently.